The sky over Charleston hung low and heavy that April morning, as if the clouds themselves were bearing witness. I stood at the front of the small chapel, staring at the framed photograph of Richard resting on the easel. His smile in that picture was the same one I had fallen for 12 years ago, bright and sure, like he could shoulder the world. My hands were clasped in front of me, not out of prayer, but to keep them from trembling. Behind me, the quiet hum of voices carried neighbors and relatives, trading condolences and hushed speculation they didn't bother to hide. Margaret's perfume reached me before she did, a sharp floral scent that always felt just a little too cold for the warmth it pretended to offer. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, every gesture deliberate, every glance calculated. At 64, her posture was ramrod straight, her hair perfectly coiffed, her black dress tailored like she had an appointment with the governor after this. When her eyes met mine, they didn't soften. If anything, they sharpened. She leaned close enough for me to feel her breath. "You'll be all right," she murmured, the kind of empty assurance people give when they have no intention of helping. Then she moved past me toward the front pew, where her friends waited, eyes darting from her to me, as if they were watching a scene unfold in a play. I let my gaze wander to the stained glass window above the altar. The light filtering through painted everything in soft blues and reds, but nothing could soften the knot in my chest. Inside my purse, folded beneath a packet of tissues, was the thick envelope Richard had handed me months before he died. Inside that envelope was the deed to a house no one in this room knew about. No one but me, Richard, and David Clark, the attorney who had handled all our paperwork. Aunt Loretta approached with a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic. She pressed them into my hands like they were a shield against grief. "We're all here for you," she said. I smiled because it was easier than telling her the truth that most people here were more interested in what Richard had left behind than in how I was holding up. The service began, the pastor speaking about legacy and love. I kept my eyes on Richard's picture, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the crinkle at the corner of his eyes, the way his tie sat slightly crooked, like it always did when he dressed himself in a hurry. My mind drifted to Savannah, to the white columned porch of that second house, the sound of the river at night. I could almost hear Richard's voice telling me to be patient, to keep it safe. After the final hymn, people spilled out into the churchyard, clusters of black coats and dark umbrellas, moving toward the reception hall. Margaret stood near the exit, shaking hands, receiving condolences, as if she were accepting campaign donations. When I passed her, she stopped me with a hand on my arm. "We'll need to talk soon," she said, her voice low but firm. "About everything." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and stepped outside into the damp air. The magnolia trees along the path were just starting to bloom, their petals pale and almost translucent. The smell reminded me of summers with Richard, but the memory was too sharp to linger on. Inside, the hall tables were lined with casseroles and cakes. I moved through the motions, accepting embraces, answering the same questions again and again. "How are you holding up? What will you do next? Do you think you'll stay here?" Every answer was a variation of, "I'm taking it one day at a time," because anything else would invite more questions I wasn't ready to answer. Near the coffee urn, I overheard Margaret speaking to two of Richard's cousins. "It's just a shame," she was saying, her voice carrying more than she realized she has no roots here anymore. I froze, my fingers tightening around the paper cup. She knew exactly what she was doing, planting seeds in other people's minds, shaping the narrative before I had the chance. When I turned, her gaze found me across the room. She didn't look away. Her lips curved into something that might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the steel in her eyes. Then, in a voice loud enough for the nearest table to hear, she said, "You don't have anything here anymore, Claire." The room seemed to still for a moment, a few heads turning toward us. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I held my expression steady. I sipped my coffee, set the cup down, and walked toward the far door without a word. Outside, the air was cooler, the breeze off the harbor lifting a strand of hair from my face. I kept walking down the gravel path toward the parking lot, each step a reminder that this was just the beginning. 2 days later, my phone lit up with Margaret's name, just as I was folding laundry in the quiet of the house. Her voice was clipped and formal, as if we were strangers discussing a business transaction. She wanted me to come over that afternoon, she said, because we needed to talk. She did not ask if it was convenient. She simply told me she would be home at 3. I almost said no. Every instinct told me to keep my distance to avoid any situation where she could corner me. But the thought of her twisting my absence into some proof of guilt or weakness made me agree. I told her I would be there and hung up before she could hear the hesitation in my voice. The drive to her house took 15 minutes, long enough for my mind to run through every possible reason she had called me. Her brick colonial stood on a manicured street lined with dogwoods in full bloom. The front yard looked like it had been combed, every blade of grass in place, the kind of order Margaret thrived on. She opened the door herself, wearing a cream sweater and slacks, her pearls catching the light. Her smile was polite, but it did not reach her eyes. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral. I followed her into the sitting room, a space I had always found more like a museum than a home, with its stiff furniture and carefully placed photographs of Richard at various stages of life. We sat across from each other, a low glass table between us. She folded her hands in her lap, studying me the way someone might examine a puzzle missing a piece. "I know things have been difficult," she began, her voice soft enough to sound almost kind. "That is why I think it is best for all of us to settle things quickly." I nodded slightly, waiting for her to get to the point. She started asking about my job at the design firm, whether I planned to continue working there, how much I was earning. I gave her short answers, careful to reveal nothing more than necessary. Her questions shifted to the house, the one Richard and I had lived in since our wedding. She suggested, in the way people suggest things, they have already decided that selling it would make the most sense. The words hung in the air between us. Selling would mean dismantling the last physical piece of the life Richard and I had built together, the only home we had shared publicly. I sipped from the glass of water she had poured, letting the coolness steady me before I replied. I told her I had not made any decisions yet. Margaret's expression did not change, but her tone cooled. "You know, Claire, when families work together, things go more smoothly. When they don't, things can become complicated." The pause before that last word was deliberate. I met her gaze and held it. "I understand," I said. For a moment we sat in silence, the clock on the mantel ticking evenly. She leaned back slightly, studying me, as if weighing how far she could press. Then she smiled again, thin and precise. "We will have a family meeting next week. Everyone will be there. We will go through everything and put this to rest once and for all." I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten, but I only nodded. "All right," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She stood, signaling the conversation was over. As I walked back through the hall, my eyes caught the photographs on the wall. In one, Richard was 10 years old, sitting on a dock with a fishing rod, his grin wide and unguarded. It was a version of him Margaret could never control, and I wondered if she ever saw it that way. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain, the clouds rolling in over the neighborhood. I stepped off her porch, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. The meeting was coming, and with it the first real test of whether I could keep what Richard had left me hidden where it belonged. A warm spring breeze carried the scent of wisteria as I remembered the day Richard first took me to Savannah. It had been exactly a year before he died, a trip that seemed spontaneous at the time. We drove along narrow streets shaded by ancient oaks, draped in Spanish moss, the air thick with history. He had been quiet most of the ride, his hand resting on the gearshift, eyes fixed ahead like he was carrying a secret too big to share all at once. When we pulled up to the house, I thought it was a dream. 2 stories of whitewashed brick, tall shuttered windows, a wide porch with columns that seemed to welcome you home before you even stepped inside. The river shimmered just beyond the backyard, and I could hear the distant hum of a boat engine. Richard stood beside me on the gravel path, watching my face instead of the house. "Do you like it?" he asked, and I could only nod. Inside, the hardwood floors creaked softly under our feet, polished, but still showing the wear of years gone by. The kitchen was flooded with light from a wall of windows, and the upstairs bedrooms looked out over the water. Every room carried the quiet dignity of something built to last. Richard leaned against the doorway of what would have been the study, his arms crossed, a small smile on his lips. "If things ever change," he said, "this will be where you start again." His tone was steady, but there was a gravity behind the words that unsettled me. I remember asking him what he meant. He didn't answer right away, just walked over to the window looking out at the river, as if searching for the right phrasing. Life is unpredictable, Claire. I want you to have a place that's yours, no matter what happens. It was the first time I realized he might be preparing for a future I couldn't yet see. Later that day we met David Clark in his office on Bull Street. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. David had a manila folder already prepared, the paperwork neatly clipped together. The title would be in both our names, Richard explained, but no one else needed to know it existed. David nodded in agreement, assuring me it was perfectly legal to keep the property separate from our primary residence. When the last signature was on the page, Richard slid the keys across the desk to me. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said. "I'll have a set, but you should always know where yours are." We drove back to Charleston that evening in comfortable silence, the kind that feels like understanding without words. I didn't know then how important that day would become, how much weight those keys would carry. The memory faded, pulling me back into the dim light of my bedroom. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Rising, I crossed to the wardrobe and opened the top drawer. Beneath a stack of sweaters was a small black box. Inside lay the keys, cool and solid against my palm, their edges worn just enough to fit perfectly between my fingers. Beside them was the envelope with the deed, my name printed clearly alongside Richard's. I sat there for a long moment, the box open on my lap, the past and present colliding in the space between my hands. That house wasn't just a property. It was a lifeline, a shield against whatever Margaret thought she could take from me. Carefully, I closed the box and slid it back into the drawer, covering it with the sweaters, like a secret buried just beneath the surface. The meeting was still days away, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't walking into it defenseless. The morning was overcast when I pulled into the small parking lot outside Clark and Hughes LLP. The building was an old brick structure with tall windows and a brass plaque beside the front door. I had been here before, but today felt different. My hand lingered on the car door handle for a moment before I stepped out, the cool air cutting through the heaviness in my chest. David's office was on the second floor, past a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of the city. He greeted me at the door with his usual calm demeanor, his salt and pepper hair slightly mussed, as if he had been leaning over paperwork all morning. "Come in, Claire," he said, motioning toward the leather chair across from his desk. The desk itself was a neat island in a sea of files and binders, each labeled in David's precise handwriting. He leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. "I know you're worried about the meeting Margaret has planned," he began. "We need to go over where you stand legally before you walk into that room." I nodded, keeping my hands folded in my lap. He explained the probate process in steady, deliberate words, breaking it down into steps I could follow. Most of Richard's estate, he said, would have to go through probate, since he had not left a detailed will covering every asset. That meant the house we lived in, certain accounts, and any property considered part of the marital estate would be reviewed and distributed under the court's oversight. Then he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "The property in Savannah is not part of the public estate, Claire. It is titled jointly between you and Richard. That means it bypasses probate entirely. No one has a legal right to claim it unless you decide to sell or transfer your share." A tightness in my chest eased just a little. But the relief was short-lived. David's expression didn't soften. "That doesn't mean Margaret won't try to make it an issue. If she suspects there's another property, she might push you directly or through other family members. She might even try to frame it as something Richard intended for the family as a whole." I felt my jaw tighten. "So what do I do?" He shook his head. "You say nothing. You do not confirm it exists. You do not hint at it. You do not bring it up even if someone asks you directly. If they have no proof, they have no leverage. Silence is your strongest protection right now." The words sank in heavier than I expected. I thought of Margaret's eyes on me at the funeral, the calculated edge in her voice when she talked about selling my home. She thrived on knowing more than the person across from her. David pulled a folder from his drawer and slid it toward me. Inside were copies of the title and relevant legal documents for the Savannah house, all stamped and signed. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere no one can get to without your permission." I traced my finger along the edge of the paper, feeling the weight of every decision Richard had made before he died. David's voice was steady but firm. "If you let your guard down even for a moment, she will find a way to use it against you. You have to think of this like a chess game. Every move you make should serve to protect that property and your future." I folded the papers carefully and slipped them into my bag. The leather felt heavier than it had when I walked in. As I stood to leave, David added one more thing. "She will try to provoke you. She will want you to react so she can claim you are unstable or irresponsible. Don't give her that satisfaction." I met his gaze. "I won't." The air outside was cool and damp as I stepped out of the building. The sky had darkened while we spoke, clouds gathering low over the rooftops. I walked to my car, the folder pressing against my side through the fabric of my coat. In the quiet of the driver's seat, I sat for a moment, the scent of rain drifting in through the cracked window. David's warning echoed in my mind. Silence was my strength now, and I intended to keep it. Margaret's dining room smelled faintly of polished wood and the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer. The long table was set not for a meal, but with stacks of papers, a silver carafe of coffee, and a plate of untouched lemon cookies. Every seat was filled, the hum of conversation dying down as I stepped inside. Eyes turned toward me, some offering polite smiles, others scanning me as if I were an entry in an inventory list. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon light. She gestured toward the empty chair at the opposite end. "Sit, Claire. We have a lot to cover." I slid into my seat, smoothing my skirt under the table, and glanced down at the yellow legal pad in front of me. It was blank, and I intended to keep it that way. Margaret cleared her throat, and the room quieted. She began reading from a printed list in her clipped, precise voice. Richard's primary residence valued at approximately $950,000. Joint bank account balances, retirement funds, furniture and personal effects. She paused between each item, her gaze sweeping the table as if expecting objections or claims. When she reached the end of the list, a murmur moved through the room. Emily Carter, Richard's sister-in-law, leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, maybe we should take a break before going into more details." Her tone was gentle, almost placating. Margaret's eyes narrowed just enough to catch it. "We will finish, Emily. There are still questions." I kept my expression neutral as the questions started. Who would handle the sale of the house? Did Richard have any investments that were not listed? What about life insurance? I answered what was necessary, no more. Then Nina Reynolds, Margaret's 29-year-old niece, leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Her dark eyes were fixed on me in a way that made the air feel heavier. "So, Claire, are you sure Richard didn't leave anything else?" The question was casual on the surface, but her gaze was sharp. My heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from the deliberate focus it took to control my reaction. I let a small, calm smile cross my face. "No," I said, then turned toward Emily to ask her about her children's school year. The shift was intentional. My voice was light, my posture relaxed, as if Nina's question had been about the weather. From the corner of my eye, I saw Nina blink, her mouth tightening just slightly before she sat back. She didn't press, but I could feel her curiosity still hanging in the space between us like static. Margaret moved on, talking about the timeline for clearing out the main house and who would take which items of furniture. Names and objects were paired off, each assignment announced like a final verdict. I nodded politely when something of Richard's was mentioned, though none of it touched the real heart of what he had left me. The conversation circled back to finances, Margaret's tone firm and unwavering. She wanted the house listed within a month. She expected cooperation from everyone involved. No one openly disagreed, though Emily's frown deepened with each passing minute. When the meeting finally adjourned, chairs scraped against the hardwood floor, and people gathered their coats. Nina lingered near the sideboard, pretending to check her phone, but her eyes flicked toward me more than once. I thanked Margaret for hosting my voice as steady as it had been all afternoon, and stepped out into the fading light. The air was cooler now, a thin breeze carrying the scent of the garden's last blooms. I walked to my car without looking back, the sound of murmured conversations fading behind me. Inside the car, I sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the wheel. The question Nina had asked replayed in my mind, but my answer had been the only one possible. The less they knew, the safer I was. It was late afternoon when I heard a knock at the front door. The sound was firm, but familiar, the kind that made you know the person on the other side wasn't a stranger. I opened it to find Helen Brooks standing there, her sandy hair pulled back in a loose bun, a cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders, despite the mild weather. In her hand was a small keyring with a single brass tag. "I thought I should bring this to you," she said, holding it out. I stepped aside to let her in, the scent of her lavender hand cream drifting past me as she walked into the kitchen. We sat at the table, the late sunlight slanting across the wood surface, warming the cool metal of the keys she had placed between us. I recognized them instantly. The Savannah House. "Richard gave these to me about a year ago." Helen began, her voice low. "He said there might come a time when you'd need them, and that it was safer for me to hold on to them until then." I ran my fingertips over the brass tag, feeling the faint engraving of the address. My throat tightened. "Why didn't he tell me you had them?" Helen gave a small shrug. "He didn't want you to worry. He said the fewer people who knew about the arrangement, the better. You already had your set, but he wanted a backup somewhere no one would think to look." The kettle on the stove began to hum softly, so I rose to make tea. The motions felt grounding, something to keep my hands busy, while her words sank in. When I set the mugs down, Helen was staring at the keys, her expression somewhere between fondness and regret. "I remember the day he bought that place," she said. "He was like a man who had just found an anchor in the middle of a storm. He told me it was for you, not for him." I listened, the steam from the tea curling in the space between us. "He said if he wasn't here anymore, you needed somewhere you could go, that no one could take from you," she continued. His exact words were, "If I'm not around, make sure Claire can start over without anyone controlling her." The air seemed to still around us. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers. Helen took a slow sip of tea, then leaned back. "I know Margaret's been circling. She's always had a way of making herself the center of everything. But Richard wanted you to have that house, Claire. That was his line in the sand." I nodded, my chest tight but steady. I had known Richard meant the Savannah House as my safety net, but hearing his words from Helen's lips made the truth sharper, more deliberate. Helen reached across the table, her hand covering mine for a brief moment. "Don't let them talk you out of what's yours." I slipped the keys into my pocket, the weight of them a quiet reassurance. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer, the air carrying the faint scent of tea and something unspoken that lingered between us. A light rain had started to fall by the time Helen left, soft drops tapping against the kitchen windows as I walked her to the door. I watched her drive off until the taillights disappeared around the corner, then closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. The keys to the Savannah House were in my pocket, their weight a reminder of the conversation we'd just had and of the promise Richard had made to protect me in his own way. I had just set the kettle back on the stove when a knock came at the door again, sharper and quicker this time. Opening it, I found Nina standing there, her hair tucked neatly behind her ears, a faint trace of perfume lingering in the damp air around her. She carried a large canvas tote and offered a smile that felt too polished. "Hey, Claire," she said brightly. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd swing by. I remembered Uncle Richard kept some of his old things here, and I thought maybe I could take a look." I hesitated, the warmth from Helen's visit still fading from the room. "Sure," I said slowly, stepping back to let her in. "Come in out of the rain." She walked in with an easy confidence, glancing around as if cataloging every detail. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Let me make some tea, and then we can see what you're looking for." But when I turned toward the stove, I heard her footsteps drifting away down the hall instead of toward the table. A low current of unease stirred in me. I poured water into the kettle, keeping my movement steady, but my ears were tracking her every step. The faint sound of a drawer sliding open reached me, followed by the creak of a cabinet door. I dried my hands and walked down the hall. The door to Richard's office was open, and there she was standing by his desk, fingers sifting through a stack of papers, as though they were hers to touch. "Nina," I said, my voice calm, but carrying enough weight to make her freeze. She turned her smile quick to appear, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I was just looking for some of his cufflinks. I remember him wearing them to family dinners. Thought it might be nice to have something to remember him by." Her tone was casual, but her gaze shifted almost imperceptibly toward the locked cabinet in the corner. "The things you're looking for aren't in here," I said evenly. "This is my space now." She gave a small, almost defiant tilt of her head. "I didn't think you'd mind." "I do," I replied, letting the words settle in the air between us. "Why don't we head back to the kitchen?" For a long moment she didn't move. Then she set down the papers, brushing invisible dust from her hands, and walked past me. I followed my steps, deliberate, keeping enough distance to make it clear I wasn't rushing her, but close enough that she wouldn't try detouring again. In the kitchen, I poured tea into 2 mugs, the steam curling in slow ribbons. We sat and I asked her about her work, her apartment in Atlanta, the kind of safe surface-level topics that didn't invite trouble. She answered politely, but her eyes kept straying toward the hallway, her fingers tapping lightly against the mug, as though she was counting the minutes until she could wander again. I made a point of keeping the conversation steady until the rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. Then I glanced toward the clock. "I'm sure you've got a drive ahead of you," I said, my tone warm but final. Nina's smile thinned, but she nodded and stood. "Thanks for the tea, Claire." I walked her to the door, watching her cross the porch and slip into her car. She waved once before pulling away, the tires hissing over wet pavement. The moment her taillights vanished, I locked the door and went straight to the office. My pulse was steady, but there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. Kneeling in front of the safe, I spun the dial, listening for each click until the mechanism released. Inside the folder with the Savannah deed was right where I had left it, the keys tucked in their cloth pouch undisturbed. I checked the other documents, running my fingers over the envelopes to make sure none had been moved. Everything was in place. Still, I stood there for a moment longer, the open safe a silent reminder of how easily proximity could turn into intrusion. Closing the door, I turned the dial until the lock caught, then stood and looked around the office. Nothing appeared out of place, but the air felt different now, tinged with the knowledge that someone had come too close. I returned to the kitchen, my tea now cold, and sat for a long while listening to the rain. The sound was steady, almost soothing, but underneath it was the quiet certainty that this wouldn't be Nina's last visit. And next time, she might not be so careless about hiding her intentions. It was early evening when the knock came, softer than Nina's, and spaced in a way that made me pause. I opened the door to find Emily standing there, her coat pulled tight against the wind, her hair damp from the mist outside. She offered a small smile, the kind that carried a mix of hesitation and determination. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. She slipped past me, shaking off her coat and glancing toward the kitchen. I gestured for her to follow and put the kettle on again, the motion starting to feel like second nature these days. We sat across from each other at the table, the space between us filled with the sound of the water heating. Emily wrapped her hands around the mug once I poured, as if drawing strength from the warmth. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she began, her voice low. "I know what it's like dealing with Margaret." I studied her face, the faint crease between her brows, the way she avoided holding my gaze for too long. She continued, "I've been on the receiving end of her pressure, her opinions, her ways of making you feel cornered. I don't want to see that happen to you, especially now." I let her words sink in, then asked, "Has she said something?" Emily's eyes flicked toward the door, as if to make sure we were alone. "She's getting paperwork together to sell the house, the main one. I don't think she expects you to fight her on it." The heat from the tea did nothing to stop the chill that crept through me. "And you're telling me this because you should be ready. I know she can be unpredictable, but I also know she plans her moves. She'll wait until she thinks you're vulnerable, then push it through. I took a slow breath. What do you suggest? Emily leaned in slightly. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't give her a reason to think you're hiding something even if you are. If she believes she's got you pinned, she'll get careless. And when that happens, you'll have an opening. I studied her for a long moment. And you're willing to help me? She gave a short nod. Quietly. I can't be seen as taking sides, but if there's something I hear, I'll tell you. Just be careful. I felt something shift in the air between us, an unspoken alliance forming in the shadows of Margaret's influence. I asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" Emily's gaze softened, but there was still steel in her voice. "Because I've been where you are, and I wish someone had warned me." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint tick of the clock. Then she said, "Just prepare yourself for her to make a move when you least expect it. She doesn't like losing, and she'll do whatever it takes to win." I nodded slowly, the weight of her warning pressing into me. "Thank you, Emily." She stood pulling her coat back on. "I'll be in touch. And Claire, keep your guard up." I walked her to the door, watching as she disappeared into the misty evening. When I closed the door, I leaned against it for a moment, the house feeling heavier somehow, as if it knew the truth of what Emily had said. I moved through the quiet rooms, checking the locks without thinking, my mind replaying every word of her warning. The kettle was still warm when I returned to the kitchen, and I poured myself another cup of tea, sitting at the table where we had just spoken. The steam curled upward, disappearing into the air, but the sense of urgency it carried stayed with me. Somewhere out there, Margaret was moving her pieces into place, and now I knew I wasn't the only one watching her game. 2 days later, an envelope slid through the mail slot and landed on the hardwood floor with a sharp slap. My name was written in Margaret's familiar cursive, deliberate and precise. I stood staring at it for a moment before picking it up, the paper heavier than it should have been. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from her attorney. The message was blunt. I was to vacate the main house within 30 days. No sentiment, no pretense of civility, just the expectation that I would comply. My stomach tightened as I read it again, as if the words might change the second time. That evening Michael called. His voice was strained, each word weighed down by something unsaid. "I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't know she was going to take it this far." "But you're not going to stop her," I said quietly. There was a pause, then a sigh. "It's complicated." I let the silence stretch until he shifted the conversation to something inconsequential. We hung up without resolving anything, but I already knew the truth. He wouldn't cross her, not for me. I spent the next few days keeping my expression neutral whenever I left the house, moving through the motions as if nothing had changed. But every evening, when the lights were low and the street quiet, I was on my laptop making lists, checking documents, organizing what I could carry quickly. On the fourth night, I pulled my coat tighter against the wind and got into the car. The drive to Savannah was just under 2 hours, the road dipping through stretches of marshland and shadowed pines. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the tires and the rhythm of my own thoughts fill the space. When I reached the quiet, tree-lined street, the sight of the house steadied me. Helen's porch light was on a warm glow cutting through the cool night. She opened the door before I could knock, her smile tinged with something like relief. "You made it," she said, stepping back to let me in. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet like vanilla. Helen handed me the keys, the same set Richard had entrusted to her, and nodded toward the hallway. "Go on. It's yours to see now." I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps muffled by the worn rugs. The living room still had the wide brick fireplace Richard loved, and the kitchen's tall windows opened toward the backyard where the grass sloped down to the water. Upstairs, the bedrooms were bare, but bright moonlight spilling across the floors. Helen followed me, her hands in the pockets of her sweater. "You should know Richard put a lot of thought into this place. He wanted you to have somewhere no one could touch." I paused in the doorway of the master bedroom, my fingers brushing the frame. "It feels different here," I said softly. "It should," she replied. "It's yours." Back downstairs we stood in the foyer. The keys felt solid in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. Outside, the river moved in slow, steady currents, catching the light from the porch. "You'll be all right here," Helen said, her voice certain. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into me. In this house, there were no eyes watching from across the table, no whispered judgments in the hallway, no threats disguised as polite conversation. When I stepped back out into the night, the air smelled clean, untouched. I locked the door behind me, the sound sharp and final. Walking to the car, I thought of Margaret's letter still sitting on my kitchen counter back in Charleston. Just one more step, I told myself. The meeting was set for Saturday afternoon, and the Bennett dining room was already full when I walked in. The heavy curtains were drawn despite the spring light outside, trapping the air in a still, almost oppressive warmth. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression set in something that looked dangerously close to satisfaction. We were waiting for no one. As soon as I took my seat, she cleared her throat and folded her hands on the polished surface. "I have spoken with the realtor, and the Bennett house will be listed this week. The proceeds will be divided according to the terms we all know." There was no pause for questions. It was as if the decision had been passed down from a higher court, and we were all here simply to hear the verdict. I felt Emily's gaze on me, soft but steady, and I gave the slightest nod, a signal that I was not going to make this a public fight. Michael shifted in his chair, glancing between us, his jaw tightening. Nina leaned back, her lips curled in a faint smirk, as if she was waiting to see me protest and fail. I didn't give her the satisfaction. "That sounds fine," I said evenly, my tone as calm as if we were discussing the weather. Margaret's eyes narrowed just enough for me to catch it. She was expecting resistance, something to press against, and when it didn't come, her shoulders eased only slightly. She moved on to details about the realtor, the timeline, the process for clearing out furniture. My responses were clipped, polite, non-committal. The conversation wound its way through every last piece of property Richard had left in the open, each one tallied, categorized, and claimed. When it was done, Margaret rose, the scrape of her chair loud in the silence. "Thank you for being reasonable," she said, the words carrying just enough weight to remind me she thought she had won. Emily stayed seated, pretending to sort through some papers. As the others filed out, she leaned toward me, her voice low. "Keep your footing." "Always," I murmured. In the hallway, coats were fetched, polite goodbyes exchanged. Margaret kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp in my nose. I stepped out into the cool air, feeling the quiet settle back around me, like a second skin. My phone buzzed as I reached the car. The screen lit up with David Clark's name. I swiped it open to find a single line of text. "The Savannah property is officially yours alone." For a moment I stood there, the late afternoon sun catching on the windshield, the words holding me still. A slow breath left my lungs, the kind you don't realize you've been holding. I slid into the driver's seat and let the door close with a firm click. Around me the street was calm, the sound of voices from the house fading behind the shut windows. I read the message again, the finality of it settling deep. Inside the quiet of the car, I let my hand rest on the steering wheel, my thumb brushing the worn leather. The road back to Charleston stretched ahead, but so did something else, something wider, freer. I turned the key, the engine humming to life, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in my chest loosened just enough to let the air in. I spent the next week packing in quiet bursts, starting early in the morning before the neighborhood was fully awake. Boxes lined the hallway, labeled in neat black marker, and the furniture I was keeping had already been arranged with the movers. I had decided to leave 3 days ahead of the deadline. The less time under Margaret's roof, the better. The sky was overcast. The morning the moving truck pulled up, a cool breeze, stirring the magnolia leaves in the yard. The crew worked efficiently, carrying boxes down the front steps, their boots thudding against the wood. I stayed focused, checking items off my list, making sure everything I cared about was loaded and secured. Halfway through, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made me glance up. Margaret stepped out, Nina trailing behind her, both dressed as if they were headed somewhere far more formal than my departure. Margaret's eyes swept the scene, taking in the stacked boxes, the open door, the emptying rooms. "So you're really going?" she said, her voice smooth but edged. I hope you find something in your budget." I kept my expression calm, almost pleasant. "Thank you for the concern. I'm sure I'll manage." Nina leaned against the porch railing, watching with a faint smile, like she was waiting for me to stumble. I didn't give her the chance. I turned back to the movers, directing them toward the last of the furniture. The rhythm of their work filled the air, a steady counterpoint to Margaret's silent inspection. When the final box was loaded, I walked back to the porch. "Well, I should get going." Margaret's lips pressed into a line. "Safe travels," she said, though the words landed like a dismissal. I stepped past her, the scent of her perfume sharp and familiar, and crossed the driveway to my car. As I climbed in, I caught sight of her in the side mirror, standing with her arms crossed, Nina beside her. They stayed there as the truck pulled away, their figures shrinking against the backdrop of the house they believed I was leaving behind for something lesser. The truth was, they had no idea where I was headed. I followed the moving truck through town, the streets shifting from narrow residential lanes to wider roads lined with oaks draped in Spanish moss. The further we went, the lighter the air felt in my lungs. At the edge of the highway, I allowed myself one last glance in the mirror. The Bennett house was out of sight, replaced by the long stretch of road leading toward Savannah. The tension in my shoulders eased a fraction, the thought of what waited for me tightening into something closer to anticipation. The movers didn't need directions until we reached the quiet turnoff that led to the river. I slowed the gravel crunching under the tires, and the first glimpse of my other house came into view between the trees. Sunlight broke through the clouds just enough to touch the roofline, the porch, the windows. I didn't stop the truck to explain, didn't look back to see if anyone had followed. Margaret could keep her assumptions. I had my own ending in mind, and it started here. The front door swung open with a soft creak, and the scent of polished wood and faint lavender drifted out to greet me. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, painting golden stripes across the floorboards. I set my suitcase down in the entryway, the echo of its wheels on the hardwood oddly satisfying. The air here felt different, quieter, untouched by the tension that had clung to me for months. I carried the kettle to the kitchen, the sound of running water breaking the stillness. As it heated on the stove, I wandered through the rooms, my fingertips brushing the smooth banister, the carved moldings, the frames of wide windows that opened to views of the river beyond. Each space felt like a promise Richard had kept, even if he was no longer here to see me claim it. When the kettle whistled, I poured the steaming water over a bag of Earl Grey and carried the cup to the back porch. The morning sun shimmered off the water, and the distant call of a heron cut through the air. I sat down, cradling the mug in both hands, and let my shoulders drop fully for the first time in what felt like forever. Richard's voice returned to me as clearly as if he were leaning against the porch rail. "Do not ever let anyone decide your life for you." I had held on to those words like a rope in the dark, and they had led me here. The days that followed were filled with small grounding tasks: unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, learning the way the light shifted through the house at different times of day. At night, I slept without waking to the sound of footsteps or the weight of someone else's rules pressing in. A few months later, my phone rang with Margaret's name on the screen. I hesitated before answering, a flicker of curiosity beneath the caution. Her voice was measured, almost polite, but there was strain beneath it. She asked for financial help, mentioning repairs she could not afford on the main house. I listened, then told her I could contribute a small amount toward the immediate fix, nothing more. Her pause stretched on the line before she thanked me, her tone thinner than before. When the call ended, I set the phone down and returned to my tea. The river kept moving, unbothered, steady. I realized then that my silence had been more than just protection. It had been a strategy. Every choice not to react, every decision to wait instead of lash out, had brought me here with everything that mattered still in my hands. In time, the house became more than a safe place. It was a reminder that patience and resolve can outlast even the loudest threats. I planted rosemary and lavender along the walkway, their scent rising each time I came home. The neighbors grew used to seeing me on the porch in the mornings, and I learned the rhythm of the tides. Looking back, I knew that I had never needed to win a war with Margaret. I had only needed to choose my battles and to make sure the ones I fought were worth the effort. This house was my proof. And if you are listening to this wondering whether to speak or to hold your ground, remember this. Sometimes silence and patience are the sharpest weapons you have. Protect what is yours, know your worth, and never let anyone else decide it for you. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay with me for the next one.